We're going to be exploring Plato's ideas about justice, the kind of state he considered ideal, and of course, the human soul.
It's a pretty ambitious undertaking, but it's amazing how these ideas from so long ago still resonate today.
Yeah, and there are so many layers to unpack. Where do you even begin with something like the Republic? I mean, people have been arguing about this book for centuries.
Well, a good place to start is always with the basics. Plato starts with a simple question: what is justice? And one of the first definitions we get is from this guy, Polemarchus. He says justice is just helping your friends and harming your enemies.
Okay, so pretty straightforward, right? An eye for an eye kind of thing.
Right, but Socrates, as he tends to do, immediately starts poking holes in this. He uses these really simple, everyday examples. Like, he says, think about a doctor. When you're healthy, you don't need a doctor or a pilot, right? If the seas are calm, you don't really need someone steering the ship. So he asks Polemarchus, when there's peace, when everything's good, what role does justice play? What is it even for?
So it's like he's saying that justice only comes into play when things go wrong.
Well, not exactly. He's trying to get at the true essence of justice, whether it's something purely reactive, only relevant in conflict, or whether it's something much deeper, a fundamental part of a well-ordered society, even when things are peaceful.
And he doesn't stop there, right?
Mm.
He goes on to argue that a truly just person would never do something unjust.
Exactly. He uses this analogy of like a musician. He says a musician can't, through their music, make someone unmusical, right? Or a skilled horseman. They can't make someone a bad rider through their horsemanship. So a just person, because justice is a virtue, shouldn't be able to create his opposite.
I'm starting to see how Socrates got his reputation for being a bit of a gadfly, always questioning and pushing people.
Oh, absolutely. And then we get this character, Thrasymachus, who jumps into the conversation, and he has a totally different take on justice, a much more cynical view, you could say.
Oh, yeah. Thrasymachus. He's not shy about expressing his opinions.
Right. He basically just cuts to the chase and says, look, justice is just what the people in power say it is. It's the interest of the stronger. And injustice is simply doing whatever benefits you, even if it means breaking the rules.
So power makes right, essentially.
That's his argument. He claims the just person is actually at a disadvantage because they're following rules that the unjust person ignores to get ahead. He gives examples like contracts, where the person who cheats often gets more, or taxes, where the just person pays their full share while others find ways to avoid it.
It's a pretty bleak view of human nature. Like deep down, we're all just self-serving, and justice is just a facade.
That's the challenge Thrasymachus throws down. He's forcing us to confront this uncomfortable idea that maybe morality is just a convenient fiction.
So then come Glaucon and Adeimantus, and they really push Socrates to defend justice, not just as a social construct or a way to avoid punishment, but as something inherently good and worthwhile.
Yeah, they say, okay, we get that injustice might seem to have its advantages in the real world, but we want to hear a defense of justice for its own sake. Like, even if there were no consequences for being unjust, wouldn't justice still be the better way to live?
So are they just playing devil's advocate, or do they genuinely believe that injustice might be the better path?
I think it's a bit of both. They present these really compelling arguments for why injustice might seem appealing. They bring up the story of Gyges, this shepherd who finds a magical ring that makes him invisible.
Oh, the Ring of Gyges. Yeah, that's a classic thought experiment.
Exactly. And the point of the story is, once Gyges realizes he can get away with anything because no one can see him, he starts doing all sorts of terrible things. He seduces the queen, murders the king, and takes over the kingdom. So Glaucon and Adeimantus are asking, if we had that kind of power, that kind of freedom from consequences, wouldn't we all end up acting like Gyges?
That's a really tough question to answer, honestly. It makes you think, do we act justly because we believe it's right, or just because we're afraid of getting caught?
It gets at the heart of human motivation, right? Are we inherently good, or do we need rules and punishments to keep us in line?
And they also bring up this analogy of a shepherd, right? They ask if a shepherd really takes care of his sheep for the sheep's own good, or just because he's going to benefit from them somehow.
Right, they're questioning the motives of those in power, whether it's rulers or even in this case a shepherd. It's like they're saying that maybe even the most seemingly benevolent acts are ultimately self-serving.
And they touch on this idea that different arts have specific aims, and that any reward the artist receives is separate from the art itself. Like the aim of medicine is health, right? And the aim of navigation is to get you safely to your destination.
Yeah, and the doctor or the navigator, they might get paid for their work, but that payment is because of a different art altogether. The art of, well, earning a living. It's not inherent to the art itself.
So I think we're starting to see the different perspectives on justice that Plato lays out in these early parts of the Republic. And it seems like Socrates has his work cut out for him trying to answer these challenges.
It's definitely complex. So how does Socrates respond? He decides to take a different approach. Instead of trying to define justice on an individual level, he proposes that they try to envision what a perfectly just state would look like.
Okay, so kind of like if we can see justice writ large on a societal scale, it might help us understand it better in the individual.
Right. And so they start building this ideal state from scratch. And at first, it's very basic. Like, you need farmers to grow food, builders to make houses, weavers to make clothes.
Like essentials, right?
Exactly. But then, as they consider the complexities of human needs and desires, the state starts to get more complex. They add in things like merchants, artisans, and even an army to protect the state.
So they realize they need more than just the bare necessities. They need people to produce, to trade, and to defend.
Exactly. And then we get to the introduction of this special class, the guardians. These are the people who will lead and protect the state. And Plato has very specific ideas about what kind of people they should be.
I bet he does. So what did he say about these guardians? What makes them so special?
Well, first off, they need to be spirited, meaning they have to be brave and willing to defend the state. But they can't just be like brute force, right?
Yeah.
They also have to have this philosophical side. They have to be lovers of wisdom and learning, able to distinguish between friend and foe.
So not just soldiers, but also thinkers, like philosopher-kings almost.
Exactly. He uses this great analogy of a dog. You know how a dog will bark at strangers but be friendly to people it knows? He says the guardians need to be like that, able to discern who's a threat and who isn't.
Interesting. So these guardians are like the ideal rulers, a combination of strength and wisdom. But then he gets into this whole thing about censorship, right?
Yes. He talks about the importance of controlling the stories and poetry that people are exposed to, especially the guardians. He thinks it's crucial that they only hear stories that depict the gods as good and just, and that portray heroes as virtuous role models.
So no tragic flaws, no stories about gods behaving badly, nothing that might corrupt their morals.
Exactly. He thinks those kinds of stories could undermine their sense of piety and their commitment to justice.
That seems pretty extreme, doesn't it? Like, who gets to decide what stories are acceptable?
I know, it's definitely a controversial point, and his views on art and poetry in general are pretty strict. He wants everything to be in service of this larger goal of creating a virtuous society.
And then there's the whole thing about their education. He's very specific about the kind of music and physical training they should receive.
Right. He emphasizes the importance of simplicity. He wants them to hear simple, harmonious music that inspires good feelings even before they fully understand the reasons why. And he wants their physical training to be focused on developing strength and endurance, not just for warfare, but for overall well-being.
So it's all about creating this balance in their souls, right? Between their physical and mental capacities, their emotions, and their intellect.
Exactly. He believes that a well-rounded education is essential for developing virtuous character.
And this education, along with their natural disposition, is what will cultivate those cardinal virtues, right? Courage, temperance, wisdom, and of course, justice. How does he define each of those within the context of this ideal state?
Right. So courage, for Plato, isn't just about being fearless. It's about understanding what is truly to be feared and what isn't. And this understanding comes from education, from knowing what is truly good and valuable.
So it's like a reasoned kind of courage, not just recklessness.
Exactly. And wisdom, well, that resides in the rulers, the guardians, who have the knowledge and ability to make good decisions for the benefit of the whole state.
Makes sense. What about temperance?
Temperance, he says, is about self-control and harmony. It's about the rulers and the ruled agreeing on who should govern, and it reflects the rule of the better part of ourselves over the worse.
So not letting our desires and passions rule over our reason.
Exactly. And finally, justice in this ideal state is about everyone doing their part, fulfilling their role, and not interfering with others. It's about each class contributing to the overall good of the community.
So a kind of social harmony where everyone knows their place and works for the common good.
Precisely. And this is where Plato connects the state to the individual soul. He says that just like the state has three parts, the rulers, the auxiliaries, and the producers, the soul also has three parts.
Okay, I'm seeing where this is going. So what were the three parts of the soul?
Well, he says we have reason, which corresponds to the rulers in the state. Then there's spirit, which is like the auxiliaries, our drive and courage to act. And finally, there's appetite, which corresponds to the producers. This is our desires, our basic needs and wants.
And how does he prove that these three parts actually exist, that they're not just like abstract concepts?
He uses this principle of contradiction. He says that something can't be two opposite things at the same time. So, for example, you can be thirsty and want a drink, but you can also specifically want a cold drink, right? That means there must be different parts of your soul at work, the part that just wants any liquid to quench your thirst, and the part that wants something cold because you're hot.
I see. So, like, sometimes our desires conflict with each other, and that shows that there must be different parts of us driving those desires.
Exactly. And just like in the state, justice in the individual is about these three parts of the soul being in harmony. Reason, guided by wisdom, should be in control, with spirit helping to keep our appetites in check.
So it's not about denying our desires altogether, but about having reason guide them so we don't become slaves to our passions.
Exactly. And he also talks about the role of women in this ideal state.
Yes, I was curious about that. What does he say?
Well, he argues that if women have the same natural abilities as men, then they should have access to the same education and opportunities. He basically says that the only real difference between men and women is their role in reproduction, not in their capacity for reason or virtue.
That's pretty radical for his time.
It is quite forward thinking. He even suggests that female guardians should receive the same training as male guardians, including military training.
Wow, that would have been unheard of in ancient Greece.
And then there's the whole thing about communal living, right?
Yes. He proposes that the guardians should live together without private property, and their needs should be met by the state.
So no personal wealth or possessions for the ruling class.
Exactly. He believes that private property leads to greed and corruption, and it could distract the guardians from their duty to serve the common good. I can see how that would be controversial. Like, wouldn't people argue that the guardians would be unhappy if they didn't have their own things?
He addresses that. He says that the focus should be on the happiness of the state as a whole, not the individual happiness of any one class.
So it's kind of like the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
Right. And he also talks about the dangers of both extreme wealth and poverty, how they can lead to social unrest and a decline in the quality of work.
It's interesting how these ideas are still relevant today. We're still grappling with issues of inequality and social justice.
Absolutely. And then after laying out this vision of the ideal state, Plato also explores how states and individuals can decline from that ideal.
Okay, so what does that decline look like? How do things start to fall apart?
Well, he outlines a progression of states, starting with aristocracy, which is the closest to the ideal, then descending into timocracy, which is ruled by honor and military values.
So like a warrior society.
Right. And from timocracy, it goes to oligarchy, which is ruled by the wealthy.
Money talks, right?
Exactly. And then comes democracy, ruled by the people.
Isn't democracy supposed to be a good thing?
Well, Plato saw some problems with democracy. He thought it could lead to mob rule and a tyranny of the majority.
Interesting. So what's the final stage in this decline?
The worst of all, tyranny, ruled by a single oppressive leader.
So it's like a downward spiral, from a well-ordered society to one where power is concentrated in the hands of the few and ultimately the one.
Exactly. And he describes the corresponding character types for each of these states. So you have the aristocratic man, who is just and virtuous. The timocratical man is ambitious and loves honor. The oligarchical man is driven by greed and money. The democratical man is undisciplined and pursues every pleasure. And finally, the tyrannical man is ruled by his passions and desires. He's like a slave to his own worst impulses.
And even though the tyrannical man might have power, Plato argues that he's actually the most miserable of all.
Precisely. He says the tyrant is constantly living in fear, he can't trust anyone, and he's never truly satisfied.
It's like that old saying, uneasy lies the head that wears a crown.
Exactly. And this leads to a discussion about the nature of pleasure. Plato distinguishes between true, lasting pleasures that come from the pursuit of knowledge and virtue, and the fleeting, superficial pleasures that come from satisfying our base desires.
Like the difference between the joy of learning something new and the fleeting pleasure of eating a really good meal.
Right. And he argues that the philosopher, because they've experienced both kinds of pleasure, is in the best position to judge which is truly more fulfilling.
So the life of the mind is ultimately more rewarding than a life of indulgence.
That's Plato's view. And at the core of his philosophy is this concept of the form of the good.
Okay, the form of the good. That sounds pretty abstract.
It is. He uses the analogy of the sun. Just like the sun allows us to see things in the physical world, the form of the good illuminates our minds and allows us to understand true reality.
So it's like the ultimate source of knowledge and truth.
Exactly. And to illustrate the challenge of understanding the form of the good, he tells this famous story, the Allegory of the Cave.
Oh, I've heard of that one. What's it about again?
It's about these prisoners who are chained up in a cave their whole lives. They can only see shadows on the wall, and they think that's all reality is. But then one prisoner escapes and climbs out of the cave into the sunlight. At first, he's blinded by the light, but then he starts to see the real world for the first time.
So the cave represents our limited perception of reality, and the sunlight represents true knowledge.
Right. And the escaped prisoner represents the philosopher who has achieved enlightenment.
But it's not easy to achieve that enlightenment, is it?
No, it's a difficult and painful process. And Plato also emphasizes the philosopher's duty to go back into the cave and try to help the others escape.
Even though they might not believe him or want to leave their comfortable ignorance.
Exactly. And he talks about the importance of studying mathematics as a way to prepare the mind for this kind of philosophical inquiry.
So math isn't just about numbers and equations. It's actually a way to train our minds to think more abstractly.
Right. And he introduces this concept of dialectic, which is a method of philosophical reasoning that aims to arrive at truth through dialogue and critical analysis.
So kind of like a back and forth argument where you test different ideas until you reach a deeper understanding.
Precisely. And ultimately, the goal of dialectic is to grasp the form of the good, to understand the ultimate source of all truth and beauty.
So after this long journey through the Republic, where does Plato land on the question of whether the just life is better than the unjust life?
He concludes that the just life is indeed superior, that it leads to true happiness and fulfillment. He says that the just soul is harmonious and well-ordered, while the unjust soul is chaotic and full of conflict.
And he even argues for the immortality of the soul.
Yes, he believes that the soul can't be destroyed by physical harm, that it can only be corrupted by its own wickedness. And because true justice is about aligning our souls with the form of the good, he suggests that this pursuit of justice has implications that extend beyond our earthly lives.
He ends the whole dialogue with this incredible story, the myth of
The myth of yes. It's about a soldier who dies in battle and journeys to the afterlife. And there he sees souls choosing their next lives.
So like reincarnation.
Similar to that. And the point is that the choices we make in this life have consequences for our future lives. Those who live justly get to choose good lives, while those who lived unjustly are forced to choose lives of suffering.
So it's kind of like a cosmic reward and punishment system.
In a way, yes. But the emphasis is on the importance of choosing wisely. The prophet in the myth says that even the last soul to choose can have a happy life if they choose with wisdom and understanding.
It's a powerful message about the importance of living a just and virtuous life, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of our future selves.
Exactly. And it brings us back to the core themes of the Republic, the importance of justice, the pursuit of knowledge, and the striving for a well-ordered soul.
It's been quite a journey through Plato's ideas. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, though. There's so much more to unpack in the Republic.
There really is. But hopefully, this deep dive has given you a taste of the depth and complexity of Plato's thought and the enduring relevance of the questions he raises.
Absolutely. It makes you think about what kind of society we want to live in, what kind of people we want to be, and what truly matters in life.
Big questions, for sure. But these are the questions that philosophy helps us to explore.
And we hope we've inspired you to do some exploring of your own. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Republic.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time for another fascinating deep dive into whatever ideas you throw our way. Keep those stacks coming.
Keep them coming.